Welcome to the Resolve to Rewind, Replay, and Rejuvenate this January webinar hosted by the Center for Responsive Schools. We are so grateful for those of you who are joining us this evening or watching at a later time on the recording. This webinar is about being able to connect with other educators who are on our panel, to be able to think about the power of a new year, a new beginning. I love new weeks, new months, and new years because it's a chance to start fresh, a chance to really reconnect to what's most important, which is those relationships with students and those foundations. And so in this webinar, you're going to be able to hear from three amazing educators and their personal experiences and their ideas of how they want to restart in January, and an opportunity for you to be thinking about how you want to restart your new year with your students in January. So again, welcome and thank you for being here. And I'm going to introduce first myself. My name is Carrie O'Grady, and I am a full-time consultant for the responsive classroom approach. And by that, I get to go into many different schools and get to share the responsive classroom approach and get to see it in action. I have been able to, I think I'm on state 43. I've been to 43 states sharing responsive classroom. And I think I'm on country 14. That was pre-pandemic, but sharing the responsive classroom approach. And so I love doing it, and I love being able to connect with other educators. And so that's why I'm so happy to be here tonight. I'm with my colleague, Nori, and she also works full-time for the Center for Responsive Schools. And she's here to keep an eye on the chat feature and the Q&A feature. So feel free to ask questions in either the Q&A or the chat, and Nori will be keeping an eye on that and trying her best to respond and take notes. And we'll check in with her at the end of our time together to make sure those questions have been covered. Nori's going to turn off her camera so she can focus in on those chats without feeling like she's being watched as she's typing away. So we'll see you a little bit later, Nori. And the educators we have here today, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, to give you a little bit of background and their current setting. And so I'm going to ask Amy to introduce herself first.
All right. Hi, good evening, folks. I have to start by saying when I saw the number of participants on such a busy month and a busy time of year for folks to hop on a Thursday night is just wonderful. So it just made me even more excited to know so many people are joining us tonight. I'm Amy Wade, and I'm a school counselor. I've been in my same counseling playroom in my same district for almost 30 years, believe it or not. And it's just been a wonderful career for me that I have loved. I love being a school counselor and helping kids and teachers and families have successful school experiences. I work mainly with the youngest end of our littlest learners, the youngest end of the spectrum, UPK or pre-K through second grade, but I certainly have worked with all elementary age levels over these years. And I have trained responsive classroom, done trainings for folks from pre-K all the way up into middle school. And I even use the great responsive classroom pedagogy when I do my college teaching, which is another hat that I get to wear. So I am a teacher at heart for sure. I work in Canandaigua, New York, which is in the Finger Lakes region, so Western New York. There is a whole other part of our beautiful state that sometimes is forgotten about. I'm almost as far west as Buffalo. And Canandaigua is a small city right on beautiful Canandaigua Lake. We are unique in that we are a huge school. We have just under 2,000 kids in our K-5 complex, and So we're a busy, bustling place. So lots of great things to share about my school experiences. My greatest joy and accomplishment, though, is my family, my husband and my 2 daughters, which I hope will not be zooming behind me tonight at some point. I let them know what was going on, but you just never know on the home front. But that is my greatest joy, the time I get to spend with my beautiful family. So welcome, and I'm so glad to be here.
Thanks, Amy. We're glad to have you here to be able to share your perspective. Beth, would you be able to introduce yourself now?
Sure. My name is Beth Osgood, and I'm coming to you from Meredith, New Hampshire on Lake Winnipesaukee. I taught for 25 years, 2nd and 3rd grade in Wolfboro, which is just around the corner from where I'm currently living. And similar to Amy, I did my whole 25-year career at the same school that I actually went to as a child. So it was a very unique and wonderful experience. Currently, I am a part-time consulting teacher for Responsive Classroom. And I transitioned just recently to teaching adult learners. So that's been a great experience for me to kind of further my education experiences. During my time, I had some extensive experience working with students with a variety of challenges in the classroom, and particularly students on the autism spectrum. So during that time, I learned that strategies that work well for that neurodiverse student population are just great teaching strategies and learning strategies for all kids. So that really helped me as an educator with that experience. So I have 2 adult children, and I love to travel, and a Responsive Classroom is fitting that bill right now. I'm going out and visiting with lots of teachers in lots of parts of the country. So I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you for being here, Beth. Sarah, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, indeed. Hi, everybody. I want to echo what Amy said. It's a real treat to be here with all of you tonight. I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York, where I live, and I work just across in Manhattan. I'm currently in a private school, and right now I'm teaching a mixed age pre-K and K class. And I got into that because after being a music teacher for the first 10 years of my career, the pandemic hit and we had to go remote. And with my Responsive Classroom training and mindset with me, I said, okay, we're going remote. Let's connect. Let's do this. Let's have a good time. And so we did. And it came to a point where then last year they said, we need someone to just be a classroom teacher for our littlest ones all year long. Would you do it? So I transitioned to being a classroom teacher in an all remote setting, which was an absolute joy. It was really wonderful. And then they said, well, if you liked it online, would you like to do it in person now? So currently I am an in-person pre-K K teacher, although as I was mentioning to the other panelists before we came on, for me, this conversation could not come at a more perfect time because I had to rush home from school finding out that starting tomorrow, we are going remote because there was a positive case in the community. So it is again a really important moment for me to connect with what is important about this work, with what rejuvenates us, about our practice, and to make sure that we can really kind of be with each other going forward. So very nice to be here with you all.
Thank you, Sarah, and Beth and Amy. I'm going to echo again what Sarah and Amy said. It's so great that so many of you have taken the opportunity to be with us tonight. And it really speaks to, I think, the need of educators wanting to connect with each other and to hear each other's experiences. And as you can see, that we have a diverse group here that are from different areas and serving different roles. And we're excited to hear their perspective and thinking about how they can make the most out of the new year with their students. So I'm going to start us off with a conversation with a question to the panelist. And I'm going to ask Amy to start us off with this conversation. And she'll share first. And the question is, what have you noticed about this school year that makes you want to be proactive about how to come back after winter break? We always want to be proactive, but this school year, it might be even more important. So what have you noticed that makes you really want to be proactive?
Sure. A few things that I've noticed is for myself personally, I feel like last year and this year, I just don't have my footing that I normally have. And even when I was just starting out and working in education the first, 3-5 years or so, I quickly felt like I had my footing. I had a groove. I had a way of doing things. And of course, year after year, decade after decade, you get even more comfortable with the footing that you have. And with the pandemic, I just feel like I don't have my normal footing. I never know what's around the corner. My typical things that I'm like, oh yeah, this is what October usually feels like, or this is the kind of referrals I tend to get in November. I just don't have that same sense of confidence, because it seems like every time I turn around, there's a new change or a new something that we're dealing with, or we're needing to deal with. And so where normally I would be proactive, and when I think about proactive, I think there's proactive and then there's proactive. And the little proactive is like, yeah, I probably should think about that. Yeah, I might think a little bit about, what I want to do in January. And we always want to do that and be proactive. But this kind of proactive is more like a really deep thinking and reflecting on, there will be unknowns, because I don't know, like what Sarah's facing, if we'll stay open prior to our winter break. So I don't know. I don't know when January rolls around, if we'll come back in person or not. I don't know. So there's so many unknowns that I feel like my proactive thinking has to be deeper, and I have to think about a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different things in preparing. But having said that, there's things that we do know, right? Like we know that when kids come back after having been home for a couple of weeks, we know that needs a reboot, or they need a little bit of a grace period, or sometimes there's a little honeymoon in January, and then things start to kind of ramp up as you move through January. Like there's some things that we do know that we can rely on and think back on in terms of how to be proactive in setting them up for success come the start of the new year. I've noticed, at least in my role, school adjustment is a huge thing that you deal with as a counselor. So especially with your littlest learners, but school adjustment happens all the way right on through. It shakes out quite a bit more as you hit 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, but primary, it tends to linger for a little bit. And I've noticed that last year and now into this year, the school adjustment looks a little different. So that adjustment period that kids have, those first 6 weeks of school, has extended. Some of my kiddos are just now kind of getting their footing into the school year. And so things are a little bit delayed. Things are taking a little bit longer. Some kids are having a little bit more difficulty getting, adjusted. So I think come January, just keeping that lens of understanding that, yep, there might be that adjustment period where normally I feel like in the first week or so, we kind of reboot and we get right into the groove. It might not look like that, this year. So I guess my big takeaways as I was thinking about that question is just, being kind to myself, that I don't even have my footing, and things, I might have a lot of unknowns, and that's okay. I'm going to rely on the things that I do know, the things that I have experienced in the past, and successes that I have found in the past, and rely on those as I move into this unknown territory of January around the corner.
I think what you were saying about being kind to yourself is so important. And being kind to our students, having empathy that this has been a hard year, and being home on winter break for some of our students is going to be a wonderful experience. And for some, it might be challenging. So, Sarah or Beth, would you like to add your thinking?
I'd like to jump in. I think just relying on that social connectedness piece and reestablishing that community provides those students with that security of, getting back with the group and the rituals of the classroom, having the morning meeting to look at and the greetings and the shares and the activities so that they can reestablish those relationships with each other and with you as their teacher, and just providing that structure for them so that there's that security and the predictability and the routine, so that that transition back hopefully will be more comfortable for them as they get back into the whole group community.
Absolutely. As you know, the safety of school and those routines are so important. Sarah.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I find also personally, I have less bandwidth in this current moment. I'm responding to so much change all the time that I also want to be proactive for myself. As Amy is saying, we don't have this footing. And so being able to know that I can rely on certain things like a format of morning meeting, which can work remote or in person. And I know that will be there for me. I will have that. I can teach into it. And then I will be able to be more present, because I find with all of this, with all of the changes and all of the unknown and all of the stresses, I just feel like my bandwidth is a little bit less for taking in new things. And so one way of, in fact, finding that kindness for myself is through being proactive in setting up structures and routines for the future.
So those structures and routines not only provide emotional safety for our students, but for us as teachers. And going back to, there's so much unknown, but I know morning meeting. I know how to do this. So this might be asking you to, look a little bit into a crystal ball, which is, as we're saying, we don't know, we haven't experienced this before. But my next question, and Sarah, I'm going to ask you to start us off on your thinking, is what challenges might be different this year as students return to school after vacation? And how might you prepare to meet those challenges?
It is such a challenging moment. And one thing we are dealing with today is that tomorrow is in fact our last day before winter break. And we're going remote, and we're not even really going remote. We're having a whole school gathering, and that's it. And so we're not even starting with that closure before the winter break happens, which already, no matter what, feels like a really big challenge. It feels really disruptive to routine. And then we don't know, are we going to start remote? Are we going to start in person? If we start remote, that poses challenges. Then transitioning back into in person has its own challenges. Um, a couple of things that we're doing are, one, we are inviting our students to an online meeting tomorrow, even though we are not, there isn't necessarily one scheduled, but we feel it's so important. My co-teacher and I are also sending photos, little postcard photos that we made out to our students over the break, just so that they can stay connected. And one other thing we did today was actually, as we were packing up our remote supplies for them to take, we have a class stuffed animal that's sort of a support animal for our community. And we took a picture of the stuffed animal and we put it into our remote materials that may go home with them. Because I think a theme that I'm hearing coming up, which really resonates with me, is that no matter what happens, no matter where we end up, we have each other and we have our relationships. And so, to me, the way to respond to these challenges is to not only remember that, but to nurture and prioritize that as absolutely what comes first. And so that to me is how I'm really responding to it, is just remembering I'm here because I love this work, because I enjoy these people, because we're building a community where we treat each other in certain ways. And so those are the things that I want to hold on to and that I want to create more of in planning for what comes next.
What you shared, Sarah, is really coming back to remembering why, the heart of the matter of why we're together, and keeping that, and I think that's so important during challenging times, is to keep the why right in the forefront of our thinking. Amy or Beth, did you want to add any thinking?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the pandemic brings just more layers of things. So we know when kids are on an extended break from school, that sometimes their home environment is different than the school environment. The rules of home or the neighborhood are different than the rules and expectations of school. And some kids make that shift pretty easily and they figure out like, yep, I do this here, but I don't do that here. And they, kind of flow with it. Other kids, that's tough and that can be challenging and they might need support, in that process. So that's what we know. Then you throw on the layer of the pandemic and there's so many more pieces to it. So for some kids, their holidays and time may look very different this time than it did last year. They may be seeing more people, they may be seeing less people. They may be doing more things, they may be doing less things. There can be, the layer of illness and grief and loss that we're facing because of the pandemic that can be affecting kids and families, as we continue to move through this. So there's just different layers that I think the pandemic and the state that we're in right now brings to this time of making these transitions and how do we prepare. So just really, putting ourselves in those places and reminding ourselves that not every child and family's experience is going to feel like mine. And, good, bad, or indifferent, they'll have different experiences, and just remembering that those layers, come with them through those doors when they return in January. And they may be carrying things that they didn't carry when they left in December, and being thoughtful and mindful, of those things. But just to echo, there's such security in our practices. And there's so many things that we know are good for kids, good in our teaching. And so when we start to feel that kind of snowball of what am I going to do, reminding ourselves and going back to, I know how to talk to kids in a way that's empowering and edifying and effective. I know how to welcome them into my space every day with my morning meetings. I know how to respond to discipline in a way that doesn't harm the community, but teaches. So going back to those things and just sort of soaking in those as we prepare ourselves for coming back, I think can be helpful to that.
And I think you're leading us into our next question is, so what are some effective ways to breathe new life into classroom rules and routines this time of year? So we were saying that our teaching practices support the students feeling safe emotionally, physically, cognitively, and they also help us feel safe. And one of those effective strategies is that having classroom norms, agreements, rules, whatever you call them, and to clearly teach routines and procedures. So, Amy, if you could get us started thinking about what are some ways to do that this time of year.
Sure. One of the things that I learned a while back from my not so good practices was to not have rules be something that I set by 9:15 on the first day and then kind of put them over here like, yep, we have our rules and now that's done. And now I hit the ground running and I sort of never go back to talking about them or thinking about them or referring to them. It was sort of like a one and done on day one of school. And I really learned from, mentors and getting to be around great educators that those rules should always be that living document. And that's whether you're teaching pre-K or middle school or whatever level you might be at. that our rules and our norms, our expectations that we set should just be this living document, this living, breathing thing that we talk about every single day in our classroom. So years ago when I did the one and done, then in January, I was like, okay, now it's time to get that off and, get it out and dust it off because we got to talk about it again. It's January where I hadn't really, been doing all of that all along. So the January piece seemed like it had to be this huge unveiling of our rules process again or something. And I learned that if I'm doing this all along, it's a very natural thing come January to just look at it maybe in a little bit different way through a different lens, but it's a very familiar. So I just want to put a plug in for remembering to have things like our rules say, or one of our rules is, or the rules in our classroom are, or you were really hoping to do this year, so following the rule of helps. All of that teacher language should just be rolling off our tongues every day, all year long, in our classrooms. And then we've got this great foundation to circle back in January and say, so let's think about our rules and let's think about our goals and let's go back to that and think about where we are now. I also want to put a plug in about observation, because when kids come back those first couple of days, couple of weeks, just like I say to teachers, don't feel like you have to set your rules by 9:05 on the first day. Like we fall into that trap of what am I going to do if I don't have my rules? So remember to give yourself time and permission to take time to set up those rules and follow that rules process that we advocate for in Responsive Classroom. And the same in January. Don't feel like, okay, January 2nd, we're back at 9:05. I'm going to get out these, this conversation on the rules. Give yourself permission to observe. How are they coming back? Looking at where they're at in different places, and then use that knowledge, use those observations to think about, okay, what's my conversation going to be around our goals and around our rules, and how might that look and how might that feel? So really kind of giving yourself time to watch and see how they come back and be really reflective in it, and not be like I was, where I was just driven to check it off my list, got the rules revisited January 2nd, now I'm done and I'm ready to hit the fast track again. Really slowing it down so that you're getting the most bang for your buck out of that time you're spending investing in the rules.
Amy, I appreciate how you reminded us to constantly refer to the rules. I know with my teaching experience, I taught mostly older students, 4th, 5th, 6th grade. And I would say they're in 6th grade. They should know the rules. But this really keeping it alive, that this is the way we said we were going to be as a community. And particularly when I'm thinking about my experience with older students, is that really being able to have deep conversations around how we want to be as a community. And I had a personal goal of referring to our classroom rules 10 times a day, because this is how we said we wanted to be. And so to do so in a proactive and positive way. So that might sound something like, we're about to start our group projects and we agreed that we were going to be respectful to each other. So let's talk about what that's going to look like. What would that sound like? What would we see? What would we hear? What would we feel? And then also not only in that proactive way, but positively in the reactive way of, because we let them know when they're not doing the right thing. We need to let them know when they are. So saying things like, I'm watching you as you're working with your team, and I see people are listening to each other. I see taking turns. You're really practicing our skill of being respectful to each other. Sarah or Beth, what are you thinking about rules and routines?
Well, I just, what you were saying about the older kids reminded me of some experiences that I've had when I was teaching music and working with the older grades. And one of the things that I remember is, we'd start the year and I'd use my interactive modeling and I'd set things up, and it was so wonderful. But then as things went, maybe it wasn't the best way to do it. Maybe something needed a little bit of modification, and it began to feel like one way to keep things feeling fresh and alive was, as you're saying, Carrie, to really reflect with the students. And especially when we're talking about, I would have days where I'd have 3 fourth grade classes and then 3 fifth grade classes or something like that. And what worked the best for them was different from class to class. And so when you have the rules as your guidelines and you can say, well, how are we going to do this? We want to feel good. How are we going to do it in a way that takes care of others or whatever it may be? They can really invest themselves in that process, which I think is especially important for those older kids to be able to make the routine work for them as a group.
I just want to build on what several people have said. I think that observation piece is key, because then you can give the students, through that reinforcing language, the things that are doing what they're doing well. So you can reinforce that behavior so that they know they're on the right track, and then tie in the reminding when necessary. But I think that observation, really looking at your kids and knowing, what they're able to do, and reinforcing the things that are going well and building off that, and the success. So success build success. So really pointing out those key pieces that are where they're finding success.
Thanks for sharing that. To continue our conversation about things that we can do to help in January, is that that many teachers notice that when their students return to school in January, they've reached another developmental level. That, thinking about when we started the school year, that your students mostly were 11, and now coming back, a lot of them are 12. And that's in 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds are different, that there are different characteristics. And so with that in mind, what are some ways to revisit individual hopes and dreams in the elementary level, or the SMART goals in the middle school level? Beth, will you start us?
Sure. So for myself as a teacher, I would always revisit yardsticks, because at that time, teaching third grade, we had 7, 8, and 9-year-olds. And so there was quite a span. So those 7-year-olds are now 8, those 8-year-olds are now 9, and some of them are on their way to 10. So just really, really looking at the milestones for each age level, and the developmental characteristics of each age group, just to refresh my memory before heading back in. So once I refreshed my memory, then I would really look at the students. And for third graders, they seem to really hit their stride come about mid-January. So it was important time to start looking at their goals and start being a little bit more self-reflective. So looking at what they said in the beginning of the year. Is that still applicable to you? Is that still something you want to do? And maybe adding on to that, giving them a view of what the second semester is going to look like. So maybe you want to reconnect with a previous goal, or maybe set a new goal, depending on where you're headed. So I found at that point, the students were able to kind of analyze also their history, like how far they've come since the beginning of the year, and look at the strengths and the strategies that are working for them. So starting to look at the process, what's going well, not just the end result, but how are they reaching those goals and the process that they're taking, so then they can reevaluate their goals and maybe rewrite goals. And we would visit them each trimester to just check in, as a way of self-reflecting and as a way of maybe goal setting in a different way or a different direction.
Really helping the students not just know the content, but know themselves as learners too, which is a lifelong skill. If they reflect on how they learn, is as important as what they learn. Amy or Sarah, would you like to add to your thinking around hopes and dreams and goals?
I was just gonna say that I find the littlest learners, so our pre-K and K and 1, and then our middle schoolers, very similar in some ways, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But those developmental shifts are very notable at both ends of the spectrum. And so when we think about a 4-year-old turning 5, their little lifespan is so short that 2 or 3 months makes a pretty big difference in their development and what happens as they grow. And then at middle school, with puberty and those rapid changing bodies and emotions, again, a couple of months can make a really big difference in what's happening for them. And so just kind of using that lens and thinking about, yeah, I mean, all kids make those developmental shifts for sure at every level, but particularly at those two ends of the spectrum, I feel like there are some pretty notable and big shifts that can happen. So at the younger end, we often talk about like our young fours versus our older fours, or our young fives versus our older fives. And we really break it apart down to that nitty gritty, because there is so much change that can happen just within that, in that little period. And then, of course, I've been doing a lot of thinking, because I've been getting a lot of questions when I put on my counselor hat around what is the effects of the pandemic on development. And so just even at the beginning of the year, when I was going into classrooms to teach my classroom guidance lessons, I was noticing how much more sponge-like kids were than typical. And typically they're spongy. I mean, at that age, they're soaking everything in, but they want to touch everything and look at it closely and really explore it in ways that I hadn't seen. And I think it's because of the lack of that opportunity, for a good chunk of their little lives. And so now they're really sponging it all in. So just even thinking about the layers that the pandemic brings to development, thinking of our older kids, at middle school, and the isolation factor that has come in for many kids because of the pandemic. I know there was a question about kids being resistant, and I'm sure we're going to circle back to that. That was in the chat. But a lot of that is because they don't have the trusted relationships. And so they don't know how to feel safe and comfortable with peers or adults because of isolation that they've experienced. And so that's a piece of it too. So just some things to think about with development. That Yardsticks book, I can't echo that enough, Beth, is such a great resource to get in there and remind ourselves what we do know about how kids grow.
And I just wanted to add on to that, Amy, that I think for many students, hitting developmental milestones can actually be sort of scary. And it can be wonderful and affirming, and oh my gosh, I can do this. And it can be, what have I become? Who am I now? How do I exist in this world? And I think that with developmental milestones comes some vulnerability, especially in the older grades. And as much as we as teachers can understand about where they are developmentally, so we can care for that vulnerability, reach out to them and build that relationship with where they have started. I know that the resistant student thing was coming up. And I think that especially with the older ones, although it's true with everyone, hitting developmental milestone, experiencing a great shift can leave people wondering if they still belong where they felt they belonged, maybe recently. And it's so vitally important for us as the educators and the adults in the space to communicate to them, you do belong. Come, you belong here. Let's do this.
So let's continue this conversation around the question that was brought up in the chat feature about we're seeing different behaviors than we have in the past, and we've mentioned that that this has been a challenging time, and some of the behaviors that we're seeing that we weren't expecting, and and Sarah, you're really tying into that. Often unexpected behavior can come from the lack of need of belonging or significance is being met for that student, and with these challenging times that need might not be met. So what are some thinking about how we can really help even our most resistant students, our most struggling students feel belonging and significance in school? Someone willing to start us off, Beth?
I just think going back to the idea of approaching that with empathy. So trying to really understand the root causes behind that disconnect or the resistance. And I always like to look at behavior or resistance as an opportunity to kind of use my detective skills and just to really figure out, what is it that they're resistant to? Do they have some unfulfilled need that's not being met? Do they have some survival need that's not being met? Are we asking them developmentally to do things that are appropriate and reasonable for them? So I think what's great about a lot of the responsive classroom practices is you can kind of go through and check off of those things as you're reflecting on students, and then to try to reach them through empathy and try to really understand where they're coming from and try to help them feel more comfortable or try to help them solve that problem that maybe is underlying their resistance.
Amy, you want to add on?
Yeah, I was just going to add on that I think connection and relationship is so foundational. And so before we can expect kids, especially middle school, where they're already in that very vulnerable, tentative, who am I, kind of place, we have to have them feel emotionally safe, connected, relationships that are positive with the teacher and peers. Because setting a goal and voicing a goal, talking about rules that you would like to have in your community, that's risky. And it may be very different than the way in which rules or expectations happen for them at home or in their community. Might look and feel very different from how it is in the school community. And so I think really not jumping too quickly to the establishing of rules. I think, for some reason we get in our minds, like every good teacher sets up their rules ASAP. Like that is a good teacher when you have your rules set. And because we put that mindset out there, we don't give ourselves time to help develop relationships, a positive community with kids, so that they're in a place to have some of those conversations and the buy-in that we want them to have instead of the resistance, I think is really important. And then, Christine, I don't think you're alone in that experience with 7th and 8th graders in particular. And then you're departmentalized and you only have them for a short period of time and you're trying to get to know many, many kids in the day. And it's a tall order. So I encourage you to, so we have the responsive classroom elementary lens of these, and then we have the middle school lens. And really you kind of get your pick of the best of both worlds because you can draw upon both of those. But I've had some middle school teachers share that they were looking more at the elementary lens and using that approach. And when they tapped into some of the middle school resources, they found that was really helpful in working through some of that. So I encourage you even to check out like the website in the middle school resources and do some searches. You might find some articles and things. There's one, the title is escaping me, Carrie, you might have a quicker one for it. But it's like seeing the best or seeing positive in our middle schoolers. I can't think of the title of it right off the top of my head. Maybe we can put it in the chat once I think of it. But that might be a really great resource, Christine, and for others that have a similar question.
I think it's seeing the good in students. Did I get it right?
Seeing the good in students. Yes.
Yes. And that's something that you said earlier that I'm connecting to is when we are seeing unexpected behavior, that it's a chance for us to figure out the why. You said that you're putting your detective lens in, and we know that behavior speaks for a student when they can't speak for themselves. It'd be wonderful if they were able to say, I'm not feeling belonging right now. I'm not feeling, but instead they, are showing it in a way that's not good for them or their community. And so really trying to figure out the why. And then it also makes me think about one of responsive classrooms guiding principles is that how us adults work together is as important as any of our individual abilities. That if we are going to create classroom and school environments that are safe and joyful and inclusive and interactive and exciting, that we have to come together as a group of adults. And when we're talking about students who are struggling, at a time where we're all struggling, I think that is so key. So an extra question to the panelists: what are some ways that you try to connect and really keep that belief of how us adults work together and the importance of nurturing that adult community as much as a student community? What are some ways that you might want to do that this January? Someone willing to start us off?
I just think, again, approaching it from the standpoint of having empathy for each other as adults, just like we have empathy for students, and being there, as Sarah said, you're running on that short bandwidth, but recognizing that in each other and being there to support each other through the challenges, and having the students see that you're supporting each other as a model for them is a great way to kind of show them, how we do that in our community, not just student to student, student to teacher, but also teacher to teacher, and including those adults that are maybe in and out of your classroom, and just modeling that with that togetherness and that camaraderie and that teamwork and that approach to supporting for the students, so they can see you doing it in action.
I often say that there's a social and emotional curriculum, whether we set one or not, and that's how we treat each other, us adults, because the students are watching that. So, Nori, I'm going to ask you to rejoin us to see if there were any lingering questions from the Q&A or chat feature that we weren't able to address. I see one question about the book Yardsticks. So several people referred to the book Yardsticks, and that is one of Responsive Classroom's books. It was written by Chip Wood. He's one of our founders of the Responsive Classroom approach, and he has dedicated his entire profession to child development. And the book is in its third version, I believe, third or fourth. And so, yes, Yardsticks by Chip Wood, and you'll be able to find it at the Responsive Classroom website. And as many of the panelists mentioned, it's just such a practical guide of knowing some typical patterns at different ages. And it really helps me to remember to have realistic expectations that, well, they're 11, and we're acting like 11's really old when we should say, oh, they're only 11, that reminder that that's a young age, and what are the realistic expectations. Nori, were there any other?
Can I add on to that? I think it's a great avenue for having conversations with parents too. That Yardstick is a great connection, so that you can really have that there as support for what you're seeing, and to field questions from parents. So it's a wonderful resource for anyone that works with children or as a parent. In one of my most recent workshops, we kind of joked that they should send yardsticks home with everyone, as when they come home with a baby, they should also have yardsticks, because it's just such an important document that we can turn to, and we'll have 3 years to read it and then jump right in. So.
And I also want to make a suggestion that I think Sarah mentioned earlier, is start with our website. And there we have, Responsive Classroom has so many great books. And whenever we publish a book, usually an excerpt from the book is turned into an article and shared and is found on our website. So if you want to start with an article to see if it's the right book for you, that's a great way. If you just go into our search engine and put in the topic of child development, you're going to get lots of articles that come from Yardsticks, and then you're going to get links to the book itself. Nori, were there any other additional questions that we hadn't had a chance to cover?
Really is just about classroom management and behavior problems. And, what do you do when you've put your rules in place, you've done all of this, and you're still having problems? What's that next step for teachers?
I can share something that's been a bit of a personal goal for me this year.
Please.
which has been really, really wonderful. One of the things that I consider a part of my approach to responding to misbehavior is energizers. And I think of them as sort of it is both a response to misbehavior and it is proactive. Because I will see, oh, we have this kid who's just can't stop moving, doesn't come to the rug, whatever, whatever. What do we need to do so that this kid gets what they need? And also gives them a sense of belonging. So rather than saying, you need to wiggle, go over to the other side of the room and wiggle, what can we do as a class? What practice can we all take? Because as Beth was mentioning, even in her introduction, what is good for a student who has a particular challenge is often really good practice for everybody. Everybody can benefit from a good energizer, but you might have one student that it's going to make the difference between whether they'll be able to engage with the group or not. So really focusing on energizers and in middle school, they're the brain breaks, thinking of ways that you can have a release. That is a moment when you can start to meet some of those other needs as well.
I was just going to add that.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to add, reminding ourselves that proactive first and proactive in the biggest way. So we tend to want to have that magic answer for what do I do when kids are misbehaving or they're resistant or they're challenging, and what am I going to do in response to that? And sometimes there is a what am I going to do? That's why I have a job as a counselor. I have a lot of job security in that what are we going to do? But there's also all of these proactive pieces that we really don't want to lose sight of. And we want to bolster up how we're teaching those expectations and routines to set them up for success, and how we're using our language to help guide them towards those positive behaviors, and how we're building those relationships through having morning meetings in our community. All of those positive, proactive pieces really are foundational to then having just a few that need more than that to give you time, and then you have time and energy to address those few. But sometimes it feels like it's most. And if you're feeling like it's most, I for myself, when I get in that boat, I like to say, okay, let me go back and review what I'm doing proactively first. What do I have in place? Where are my gaps? What might I be missing? And so if you're kind of feeling like, oh, I can relate to that, I feel like it's happening with most. Again, I can't stress enough the resources. I mean, we could spend a whole hour webinar, probably a whole 4-day course talking about, what to do when kids misbehave. So tapping into those resources of the proactive, what are all those good proactive strategies, and really tightening those up.
I appreciate you saying that, Amy. And we, as you do know, we do have 4-day courses on how to respond to misbehavior. And the things that you mentioned of the importance of that relationship with the student, that the student needs to know that you care about them in order to address any challenging behavior. And then, keeping in mind the importance of the adults working together. And Amy, everything you said about proactive is, for me as a teacher, was sometimes so hard to hear. I'd be thinking, I am doing everything. I'm giving my all. I'm doing everything. But to keep in mind that, the word discipline comes from the Latin root word disciplina, and how that translates to English is teaching. So discipline is teaching. And so thinking about what we can teach to be successful, proactively, but then also when we're responding to that misbehavior, what learning is occurring for them? What new skills do they have to be more successful in this setting? And, what environment are we creating to help them be successful? So the question is, last question I see is the record. Yes, this webinar has been recorded and the recording will be shared. And again, recommendation of, if you've registered for this website, for this webinar, you've been to our website, but I just think there's a world of free resources. I think Sarah or Amy mentioned that there's the educator place, and there's graphic organizers and planning guides. There's just a lot of free resources for educators. So I'm going to encourage you to go there. I want to end our time together with just first thanking our panelists for being willing to be here and to share your experiences, and for us to be able to hear, and Nori for helping organize this all. And most importantly, for those of you who took the time to be with us tonight, as we said, we know that it's a busy time, and it just says so much about your dedication to teaching and learning, and hope that all of you have a wonderful holiday season and winter break, and are ready for that fresh start with the students in January. So thank you again, and have a good evening.